The summer sun had just begun to bleed its first streaks of light across the quiet farmlands of Lancaster County when Jonathan Whitford's black SUV rolled along the narrow country road. He was out of place here. His tailored suit, Italian leather shoes, and the cold gleam of his silver watch clashed violently against the humble barns, endless green fields, and slow horse-drawn buggies that marked this as Amish country. Yet Jonathan wasn't here for sightseeing. The city-bred millionaire, heir to one of the largest investment firms in Philadelphia, was here because of a drunken dare, a reckless bet made in the haze of whiskey and arrogance a week earlier at his country club. Surrounded by friends who thrived on mocking anything they considered backward, Jonathan had laughed when one of them joked about how he could probably charm even the most sheltered Amish girl into marrying him. The bet was simple: marry an Amish girl within 30 days, and the pot, a pool of obscene money between him and his equally wealthy friends, would be his. He didn't need the cash, but the idea of winning, of proving yet again that there was no world he couldn't conquer, had hooked him like a drug. His first glimpse of her was not in some staged introduction, but on the side of the road, kneeling by a wooden fence, her hand stained with earth as she mended a broken post. Mary Stoltzfus wore a plain blue dress that brushed her ankles, her hair tucked neatly beneath a white prayer cap. But it wasn't her clothing that froze him mid-step when he pulled over. It was her eyes, clear, unguarded, the color of early morning skies after rain. She didn't look away when she noticed him, didn't smile either, just studied him as if weighing his presence against the quiet rhythm of her world. Jonathan had been used to women who glanced at him with a mix of desire and calculation, but Mary's gaze was stripped of both. That alone was unsettling enough to spark something he hadn't anticipated: curiosity. He approached under the guise of asking for directions, his voice smooth, practiced, the same tone that had closed million-dollar deals. But the words seemed to bounce off her like pebbles against stone. She answered politely, but without any trace of interest, then returned to her work. Jonathan lingered, making small talk, trying to draw her into conversation. Yet she gave nothing more than what courtesy demanded. And in that moment, the bet shifted from a casual challenge to something personal. It wasn't just about winning now. It was about cracking the fortress she carried in her stillness. Over the next few days, Jonathan made reasons to return, buying fresh bread from the small Amish market, wandering near the Stoltzfus farm on the pretext of exploring the countryside. He learned that Mary was 22, the eldest of 7 siblings, and carried the weight of helping her widowed father run their modest dairy farm. She rarely went beyond the borders of her community, her life defined by the rising and setting of the sun, the cycles of planting, milking, and baking. And yet, beneath her quiet demeanor, Jonathan began to sense an intelligence that was sharp but guarded. Like a hidden blade, she had no intention of revealing. Each encounter left him both frustrated and intrigued. And that intrigue was dangerous, because it started to blur the clean, merciless lines of his original intent. Jonathan had been raised in a world where people were assets or obstacles, where charm was a weapon and commitment was nothing more than a signed contract. His relationships were brief, transactional, and forgotten once the novelty wore off. Mary, however, refused to play by those rules. She didn't lean into his compliments, didn't laugh at his stories unless they genuinely amused her, and never once hinted that his wealth or polished manners impressed her. Instead, she asked questions that stripped away the armor he wore. Why did he live in the city? Did he ever feel lonely despite being surrounded by people? Did he know how to do anything with his hands other than hold a pen or a phone? These questions were not flirtations. They were quiet probes, and Jonathan found himself answering them honestly, something he rarely did with anyone. The day he first mentioned marriage came unexpectedly. They were sitting on a weathered bench outside the market, sharing a loaf of warm bread Mary had baked. The air smelled of fresh hay and the distant tang of manure, sounds of clopping hooves echoing along the road. He told her, almost teasingly, that she would make someone a fine wife. Mary didn't blush or look away. She simply said, "A husband is not just someone you choose. It's someone you stand beside when the fields are barren, when the nights are long. Do you understand that?" Jonathan had laughed, but the question lodged itself deep in him, gnawing at the parts of his mind he usually kept locked away. As the weeks ticked by, The bet's deadline loomed, but so did something far more unsettling. The creeping realization that Mary was not a mark to be won, but a person whose respect he was beginning to crave. And respect was not something you could buy, charm, or bluff your way into. He began to help on the farm, clumsily at first, his manicured hands blistering from the rough handles of farm tools, his designer shirts streaked with sweat and dust. Mary never praised him, but she didn't push him away either. She simply worked beside him, the silence between them sometimes heavier than words, sometimes lighter than air. Jonathan's friends, impatient for updates, called and texted constantly, reminding him of the ridiculous wager. He told them little, partly to preserve the element of surprise, partly because he could no longer stomach the way they spoke about her, as if she were just a pawn in his game. The lines between the bet and something deeper had blurred so much he could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. One evening, after a long day in the fields, Jonathan walked Mary home under a sky thick with stars. The only light came from the oil lamps in the houses they passed, and the air was warm with the scent of clover. At her porch, he hesitated. The words were on his tongue, a proposal, one that would seal the bet and win him the money and bragging rights he'd set out to claim. But when Mary looked at him, her eyes holding that steady, unflinching clarity, the words faltered. He realized in that moment that if he asked her for her hand under false pretenses, it would not just be a win in the eyes of his friends. It would be a loss so deep it might hollow him out entirely. Yet the bet still loomed. The clock was running out, and somewhere, in the shadows of his own conscience, Jonathan knew that whatever happened next would change him in ways no deal, no amount of money, ever had. Jonathan had always believed that control was the key to every successful venture in his life. In the boardroom, in negotiations, and in his personal affairs, he dictated the pace, set the terms, and bent situations to his will. Yet as the second week in Lancaster County bled into the third, he began to feel an unfamiliar shift. It was not just the slower rhythm of the place or the way the land seemed to breathe in long, measured exhales. It was Mary's presence, constant yet never imposing, warm yet never yielding. She lived in a world bound by tradition and faith, and while she welcomed his help on the farm without complaint, she never once altered her life to fit his. If he was late, she began without him. If he complained about the aching muscles in his arms or the dust clinging to his hair, she offered no sympathy, only a quiet reminder that there was still work to be done. And instead of bristling at her indifference, Jonathan found himself adapting. He rose earlier each morning, his suit jackets and polished shoes replaced with worn jeans and boots. He began to anticipate the feel of soil in his hands, the honest exhaustion that came from labor no money could shortcut. There were moments in those days when the bet seemed to vanish from his mind, slipping into the background like a distant noise drowned out by the rustle of corn stalks in the wind or the sound of Mary humming in Oldham as she kneaded dough. But then the calls from his friends would pull him back, their voices heavy with amusement and disbelief that he had not yet sealed the deal. They teased him, prodded him for details, and mocked the idea that an Amish girl could resist a man like him. Jonathan laughed along, but the laughter rang hollow in his ears once the call ended. For the first time, he questioned not whether he could win, but whether winning in their eyes meant losing something he could never regain. Still, pride was a stubborn thing, and pride had driven him this far. He told himself he could have both, the bet and the girl, without betraying whatever fragile trust was forming between them. It was a warm evening when Mary invited him to join her family for supper. The Stoltzfus home was a modest two-story structure, its white paint weathered by years of sun and rain, the porch sagging slightly at the edges. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of fresh bread, roasted chicken, and sweet corn. Her younger siblings, shy at first, grew bolder as the meal went on, peppering him with questions about the city, the skyscrapers, and the strange concept of an elevator. Her father, a tall man with hands like rough-hewn timber, observed Jonathan quietly, speaking only when necessary, but watching him with a gaze that weighed and measured. Jonathan answered their questions with an honesty that surprised even himself, admitting that he didn't know how to milk a cow until a week ago, that he'd never driven a buggy. that he had never in his life seen stars so bright until Lancaster nights. There was laughter at the table, not the polite, calculated kind he was used to, but the easy kind that needed no performance. After supper, he stayed to help Mary wash the dishes. She worked in silence, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, her hairline damp with the heat of the kitchen. He wanted to tell her that the evening had meant more to him than any of the glittering galas or lavish dinners he'd attended in the city. But the words felt clumsy in his mouth, so he kept them to himself, letting the moments stretch quietly between them. When he left that night, her father shook his hand, his grip firm but not unfriendly, and for a brief moment Jonathan felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, the desire to be seen not as a man of wealth, but as a man of worth. The following days blurred into a pattern of shared labor and unspoken understanding. He learned to mend fences without being told, to carry heavy pails of milk without spilling, to stack hay in the barn so it wouldn't topple. Mary never praised him openly, but there were small signs. The way she would hand him the better loaf of bread, the faint smile she tried to hide when he got something right. And with each passing day, the lines of the bet became fainter, though they never truly disappeared. The end of the month was drawing near, and with it came the question he had been avoiding: how to ask her to marry him without making it a lie. One afternoon, a sudden summer storm rolled in, dark clouds swallowing the sky as sheets of rain pelted the earth. They had been working in the fields when it began, and by the time they reached the barn, both were soaked through. Jonathan laughed, not the controlled, measured laugh he used in the city, but a deep, unguarded one that seemed to surprise Mary. For a moment, they stood there, rain dripping from their hair, the thunder rolling in the distance. She looked at him differently then, as if seeing him without the layers he usually carried. He thought, fleetingly, that if he asked her in that moment, she might say yes, but the thought of her finding out later about the bet stopped him cold. He couldn't bring himself to taint that look in her eyes. Yet the pressure was mounting. His friends had started to doubt he would go through with it, and some had hinted they might call the bet off entirely. His pride bristled at the idea of walking away without proving them wrong. But the more time he spent with Mary, the more the victory felt hollow before it even happened. It wasn't that she was unattainable. He could see the small cracks in her guardedness now, but that to take advantage of them would be to destroy something rare. Still, the bet's deadline was an immovable weight pressing down on him, and he could feel the days slipping away. The night before the county fair, he sat alone in his rented farmhouse, staring at the contract they had drawn up as a joke when the bet was made. It was ridiculous. A single sheet of paper scrawled with the terms, signed in the shaky handwriting of men who'd had too much to drink, and yet it held a kind of power over him, binding him not just to his friends, but to the version of himself he had been when he signed it. A man who thought everything had a price. A man who didn't know what it meant to truly care for someone he couldn't control. He realized with a jolt that if he went through with it for the wrong reasons, he would not only lose Mary, he would lose the person he was starting to become around her. The fair brought the whole community together. Stalls filled with homemade pies, handcrafted furniture, and quilts stitched with intricate patterns. Mary moved through the crowd with ease, greeting neighbors, laughing with her sisters, showing him the traditions she had grown up with. Jonathan trailed beside her, feeling oddly protective, aware of the glances from other men in the crowd. He caught her father watching him once or twice, and instead of the cool appraisal from before, there was a subtle shift, a quiet question in the man's eyes, as if he was beginning to wonder whether Jonathan's intentions were more than a passing fancy. That look both steadied and terrified him. The moment of decision was approaching, and he could no longer delay. That evening, under the glow of lanterns strung between the trees, Mary led him to a quiet patch beyond the noise of the fair. She spoke of the harvest coming soon, of the work that would follow, of her hopes for her younger siblings. Then she asked, almost casually, what he would be doing in a month's time. The question struck him harder than he expected. He realized she was offering him a chance to tell her the truth, to explain why he had come here in the first place, to give her the choice before he took anything from her. But the words caught in his throat. He feared that if he spoke them aloud, the fragile bridge between them would shatter beyond repair. Jonathan walked her home that night, the weight of his silence pressing down on him with every step. The bet was still alive, the deadline still looming, but something in him had shifted so profoundly that he knew, no matter the outcome, nothing about his life would ever return to the way it was before Lancaster County, before the girl in the blue dress, who looked at him without fear or favor. And as he stood at her gate, watching her disappear into the soft glow of the lamplight inside, he wondered if the real gamble had never been the bet at all, but the risk of letting himself fall. The weeks after the county fair unfolded with a quiet intensity that Jonathan had not experienced in years. The air grew crisper with the turn of the season, mornings blanketed in a thin mist that clung to the fields until the sun burned it away. Mary's days began before dawn, and Jonathan found himself waking earlier to match her pace, no longer out of a desire to impress her, but because the rhythm of her life had seeped into his own. He no longer thought of the work as a novelty. His hands had toughened, his movements had grown more efficient, and he began to anticipate the needs of the farm without being told. It was during those early mornings, when the rest of the household was still asleep, and the only sounds were the creak of the barn door and the low hum of cows in their stalls, that Jonathan felt the strange peace of belonging to something outside himself. Yet the shadow of the bet still lingered over him, a quiet reminder that his presence here had been born from selfishness, not sincerity. He told himself he would find a way to reconcile both truths, but the more he tried to imagine it, the more impossible it seemed. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, Mary invited him to walk to the edge of the property. There, an old oak tree stood alone, its branches sprawling like a guardian over the fields. She told him she had come here often as a child, especially after her mother died, finding comfort in the vastness of the land stretching endlessly in every direction. Jonathan listened, his eyes fixed not on the horizon but on her face, noting the softness that entered her voice when she spoke of her mother, the way her fingers brushed lightly against the tree's rough bark as if it were an old friend. He wanted to tell her that he understood loss too, though his had been of a different kind. The slow erosion of trust, the hollowing out of relationships built on shallow foundations. But the words caught somewhere between his mind and his lips, and instead he remained silent, letting her story hang in the air between them like a fragile thread neither of them dared to pull. The nights were growing cooler, and one in particular brought with it a heavy fog that wrapped the farm in a ghostly stillness. Jonathan had been helping Mary's father repair a section of the barn roof earlier that day, and by the time they finished, his muscles ached in ways that reminded him of his first weeks here. That evening, as he sat on the porch with Mary, sharing mugs of steaming tea, she asked him why he had truly come to Lancaster County. The question was asked without accusation, but there was a weight behind it, a quiet insistence that made Jonathan's chest tighten. He offered her a half-truth, that he had been looking for a break from the noise of the city, that he wanted to experience something different. She nodded, accepting his answer without pressing further, but he could see in her eyes that she knew there was more he wasn't saying. That unspoken awareness settled between them, adding another layer to the complicated weave of their connection. The pressure from his friends was becoming unbearable. They called more frequently now, their voices tinged with impatience and ridicule. Some accused him of dragging it out because he couldn't seal the deal. Others teased that he was going soft. Jonathan brushed off their jabs, but inside he felt the grind of two opposing forces, the life he had always known, built on winning at any cost, and the one that was slowly taking shape here, built on something quieter, something that didn't need to be proven. The bet had begun as a game, but now it felt like a noose tightening around his neck. Every time he imagined standing before Mary and asking her to marry him without telling her the truth, the image crumbled into something shameful. Yet walking away meant losing face, and pride had never let him walk away from anything. The harvest season arrived in full force, demanding every ounce of energy from the Stoltzfus family. Jonathan worked alongside them from sunrise to sunset, his once immaculate clothes permanently stained, his hands rough with calluses. There were moments of lightness, Mary laughing as he tried and failed to stack hay bales neatly, her younger brothers daring him to race them through the fields, her sisters offering him slices of pie still warm from the oven. But there were also moments of exhaustion so deep, that he fell asleep still in his work clothes, waking to the sound of roosters crowing in the distance. Through it all, Mary remained a constant, steady, resilient, her quiet strength holding the center of the household like the deep roots of an old tree. It was during one of these long days that Jonathan found himself alone with Mary's father, mending a section of fence on the far side of the property. The older man worked in silence for a while before finally speaking, his voice low but steady. He told Jonathan that he had noticed the changes in him since his arrival, that he worked harder now, that he seemed to care in ways that couldn't be faked. But then he added that marriage was not a thing to be entered into lightly, and that Mary's happiness was worth more than any pride or wager. The words struck Jonathan with a force he hadn't expected, as if the man had somehow seen straight through him. He wanted to ask if Mary had said anything about him, if she trusted him, if she could ever see a life with him. But instead, he simply nodded, his throat tight, and returned to the work in silence. As the days shortened and the evenings grew colder, Jonathan began to feel the weight of time more acutely. The bet's deadline was now only a handful of days away, and his friends were expecting an answer. He could no longer pretend that the decision would make itself. Every path forward seemed to carry a cost. If he told Mary the truth, he risked losing her forever. If he kept it hidden and went through with the marriage, he would live with the knowledge that their beginning had been built on a lie. And if he walked away entirely, he would lose both the bet and the fragile sense of belonging he had found here. For the first time in his life, there was no clear win. One night, unable to sleep, Jonathan wandered out to the old oak tree where Mary had once brought him. The fields were bathed in silver light from a full moon, the air so still he could hear the faint rustle of leaves high above. He leaned against the trunk, his mind a tangle of conflicting desires and fears. He thought about the man he had been before this, confident, untouchable, convinced that the world bent to his will. And he thought about the man he was becoming here, someone who valued quiet moments over loud victories, someone who could find meaning in the slow, steady work of tending a farm, someone who wanted to be worthy of the trust in Mary's eyes. For the first time, he admitted to himself that the bet had stopped mattering weeks ago. What mattered now was her. But knowing that did not make the choice easier. The deadline still loomed, and his pride, though softened, was not entirely gone. He wondered if there was a way to come clean and still have her choose him. Not because of the bet, but in spite of it. The thought terrified him, because it meant surrendering control, placing his fate in someone else's hands. And for a man who had built his life on never doing that, it was the greatest gamble of all. The final days before the deadline settled over Jonathan like a heavy, unshakable weather front, the kind that rolled in from nowhere and refused to move on. He could feel it in his shoulders when he woke before dawn, could hear it in the way his friends' voices crawled out of the phone like mosquitoes, could see it in the reflections of himself he caught in the kitchen window when Mary turned away to rinse a bowl or set a loaf of bread to cool. The calendar on his rented farmhouse wall, once just a square grid of numbers, had become a series of narrowing doorways, each date closing behind him with a soft, unmerciful click. And yet each morning he reported to the farm, not as a spectator of quaintness, but as a man being slowly rebuilt in the hard light of repetitive, necessary work. There was no speech he could give to her father that would do the convincing for him, no check he could write to buy worthiness, no clever angle that would smuggle him past the guard dogs of conscience. He had come to Lancaster County for a bet and found himself stranded on a shoreline where the currency he knew was worthless, and if he didn't act soon, not even the truth would have anywhere left to go. The harvest deepened to its most demanding stretch, sunrises bruised with violet clouds that soon burned off and left a pale, unrelenting glare. The Stoltzfus family moved like a precise, quiet machine, each person taking their place in the choreography of picking, loading, mending, and storing. Jonathan saw how the day was a long sentence with no commas, how each task depended on the one before it being done well and honestly, and the only way to redeem a mistake was to do the next thing right. He measured his steps to that meter, finding a rhythm in the ache, a strange gratitude in the exhaustion that finally made sleep as clean and complete as a closed book. Pride, his great, familiar engine, was still alive, but had changed shape, taken on the grainy texture of showing up again and again, of shutting up when he would have defended himself, of offering to take the heavier end of the load and taking it without announcing that he had done so. One afternoon, the wind came up sudden and mean, bending the corn and carrying grit that needled their eyes. Jonathan and Mary were in the field with their 2 younger brothers, fastening a canvas to protect the stacked bales, when a corner whipped free and the youngest boy bolted after it, hat tumbling, bare feet slapping dirt. He ran straight toward the ditch where the ground gave way to a tangle of thorny low growth and a rusted roll of old barbed wire, half buried by time. Jonathan yelled, but the wind ate his voice. He dropped the rope and sprinted, catching the boy by the collar just as his foot slid. Both of them pitching sideways, Jonathan twisting to take the brunt of the fall. Barbs ripped his forearm in 4 long kisses that bled immediately through his shirt. The boy blinked hard and then cried in quick, gulping breaths, not from injury but from shock. Mary reached them on a run, her face pale to iron, and for a moment she looked not at Jonathan but at her brother, steadying him with both hands before she turned and saw the blood pooling in the crook of Jonathan's elbow. "You should have let me go," the boy said, bravado reasserting itself the moment he knew the danger had passed. "Not today," Jonathan answered, sitting in the dirt and starting to laugh, because the pain, bright and simple, felt like a relief from all the things he couldn't say. Back in the kitchen, Mary cleaned the cuts with a briskness that was firm but never cruel, the sting of alcohol like a bell rung at close range. She wrapped his arm with cloth, tied it in a knot that would not slip, and said only, "You did right," before returning to the sink. The words were small, but they landed in him like seed in watered ground. That night the restless edge inside him would not quiet, and he walked to the old oak with the moon hung thin and white above the fields, the air already cooling toward winter. He had promised himself a dozen versions of the truth, each one delayed by a better time that never arrived, and now the better time had run out. He could not carve the world into pieces tidy enough to carry both the bet and the woman who had taught him to carry weight in silence. He thought of the contract on his kitchen table, a joke inked in arrogance that had become a chain, and pictured striking a match and watching it curl to ash. But even that image carried the stink of theater, the showy repentance of a man still performing for the wrong audience. He needed the truth spoken into the air that would carry it to her ears. Nothing dramatic, nothing rehearsed. When he turned back toward the farmhouse, he found Mary on the path, as if the land had conspired to spare him one more moment of cowardice. She wore a shawl against the chill, her hair tucked away neatly, her face unreadable. "You were gone," she said simply, not as accusation but as fact, and that was the grace that undid him. He began without preface. He told her what he had said at the club, told her the laughter and the dare and the stupid, swaggering certainty that he could turn anyone's life into a scoreboard and notch another win. He told her about the contract they had passed around and signed with a flourish, told her he had come here for 30 days with the smoothness of a man who had never been told no in a way that made him listen. He told her when the change started, that it had been small, the grain of sand that makes the oyster flinch, and how he had tried to pretend it wasn't happening, because pretending was easier than looking himself in the face. He told her he had fallen in love with the quiet math of her days, the way she protected her family's rhythm without apology, the way her questions had peeled him, word by word, down to something he had not looked at since boyhood. He didn't dress the truth, didn't argue for it. He set it between them and waited for the verdict he deserved. Mary did not speak for a long time. The night closed around them, and the old oak shifted its weight in the wind. When she answered, her voice was steady in the way a taut rope is steady, but it hummed with strain. She said what he had done to begin with was wrong, not just because of the bet, but because of the presumption that she could be turned into a means for his end. She told him that she had noticed his changes, and that she would not deny what she had seen. But vision was not absolution, and sincerity born from wrong beginnings was not automatically owed mercy. She said her father had taught her that trust was like the soil. Once compacted by heavy wheels, it could be loosened but not quickly, and some places would never be the same. "You asked me once if I understood long nights," she said, surprising him because he had not remembered asking. "This is one." He began to speak again, but she held up her hand, not in anger, only to set the terms of silence. "I cannot answer you tonight," she said. "I cannot answer you tomorrow. The harvest is upon us, and the house is full of work, and I do not make decisions with noise in my head." She turned and left him there, and he stood until the cold found his bones. The next day he went to the farm anyway. No one sent him away. Her father nodded once, a simple acknowledgement that carried no verdict. The work took them from one necessity to the next, and for a while Jonathan was grateful for the tyranny of tasks. But the world is never content to let a man stay buried in his chores when his life is due for a reckoning. Late afternoon carried the faintest scent of smoke that was not the familiar cook fire, a thin, wrong note in the harmony of the place. Mary's youngest sister cried out from the yard, and then the barnyard shouted back with the sudden, frantic language of a fire that had taken hold in the old hayloft. Lightning must have kissed the dry roof earlier and smoldered, waiting for a wind big enough to coax it awake. By the time Jonathan reached the door with her father, flame was pawing through the loft boards and blinking hot orange eyes through the gaps. There was no time to call anyone. They needed to move animals, roll wagons, drag the big leather buckets and the hand pump into a plan that might not be enough. If Jonathan had thought confession was the conversion of a man, he learned then that conversion must be proved with a body. He moved like someone born to labor, not quite but close. The weeks etched in his muscles, converting to the kind of speed that is not panic but purpose. He and Mary's father hauled the heavy doors wide, smoke branding their throats, and he and the boys set the sheep moving with shouts that cut through the crackle. One cow balked, eyes wild, and he took the rope, let the animal hit the length of it, and then leaned his entire weight and will into a line that burned his palms raw, giving the cow a wall more stubborn than fear. Buckets appeared from nowhere. Neighbors drawn by the bell Mary's sister rang, as if she could wring back the rain, and the little hand pump hammered a frail rhythm that nonetheless delivered what was essential. Somewhere in that heat and smoke, he saw Mary on the ladder, a canvas over her head, beating down sparks that sought the rafters. He climbed after her without thinking and felt her elbow crack his ribs when she turned too quickly. They almost laughed because even in danger they were the same, stubborn, unwilling to surrender a single inch of the things they loved. They saved more than they lost, and only those who have fought a fire know the kind of miracle in that sentence. By full dark the flames were down to sullen, resentful embers, the barn skin blistered but not through, the animals throwing their own wet, snorting steam into the cooling air. The ground had become a slick of mud that the moon lit silver, and the neighbors, who had arrived in buggies and on foot, in aprons and work shirts, stood in a quiet that was not absence of sound so much as the stunned fullness that follows survival. Mary's father gripped Jonathan's shoulder in a way that acknowledged a debt he would never itemize, and Jonathan knew better than to put words to it. Words would cheapen it. Words often did. He rinsed his hands in the pump trough and watched the creak of blood and soot whirl into something clean enough to leave. After the fire, the talk came, not out loud at first. The bishop arrived with two elders the next morning, faces lined as tree bark, eyes watchful but not unkind. They sat at the table while Mary poured coffee. Jonathan stood at the threshold like a man waiting to be called into a room where the verdict would be cast in a language not his own. They discussed the repairs and the ways the community would pitch in without counting the cost, as they always did, because that is what communities are for when they are honest. Then they spoke about Jonathan, the Englishman who had come and stayed, the Englishman who had worked and not merely watched, the Englishman who had told the truth too late, and yet perhaps not too late, to be something other than a cautionary tale. The bishop did not dress the matter in lace. He said a marriage between worlds carried consequences, that Mary would face shunning if she left the ordinum, that Jonathan would face a different sort of shunning if he tried to drag her into a life she did not choose. He spoke of yokes and how mismatched yokes make both oxen bleed. Then he looked at Jonathan and said, "If you mean to join your life to hers, you must understand that joining means more than vows and pretty words. It means choosing a road and walking it when it is frozen, when it is mud, when it is dust. Can you pledge to a road you did not build?" The question exposed a hollow in Jonathan he did not know whether to call fear or honesty. "I do not know," he said, shocking himself, because the answer a younger version of him would have given was always yes, regardless of truth. I do not know how to be what you are asking, but I know I cannot live the way I lived before I came here. It was Mary who proposed the way forward, and she did it with the same calm with which she tied a knot that would not slip. She said that if there was to be talk of marriage, it must be rooted in a year lived under terms that tested both of them honestly. Jonathan would remain in Lancaster, forsaking the calls and contracts that demanded his absence more than his presence. He would keep the modern tools of his world at a distance, no phone, no fleet of messages buzzing his pocket into two lives. He would rise with them and work with them and pray with them if he would be in their house, not as a performance, but as a discipline. After a year, they would speak vows in the kitchen, not in a church with stained glass and microphones and applause. There would be no photographs. There would be no headlines. If the man who arrived for a bet could become the man who stayed without reward, then she would answer him. Her father looked at her then with a mixture of grief and pride, because what she asked cost her, too. The narrowness of hope pressed between duty and desire, and yet it was the only way to make a bridge strong enough to carry them. Jonathan expected his pride to rise and demand a different courtroom, a different rule of evidence. It did not. Instead, something like relief entered him, not the relief of easing pain, but the relief of a hard road finally named. He could walk a road that had a name. He told them yes, not in the language of romance, but in the simple grammar of assent. The bishop studied him for a long moment, and then nodded once. "A year," he said, as if inscribing it into the wood of the table, and then softer. "A year can make an honest thing of many beginnings." When the elders left, Mary stood at the sink and stared out past her reflection into the poured cream light of late morning. Jonathan stood a few steps behind her and did not reach for her. There are distances that must be kept for a time if they are to vanish for good. The days that followed were both more difficult and strangely lighter. Difficult because discipline always is when it ceases to be an idea and becomes a schedule. Lighter because ambiguity had been replaced by promise, and promise, when accepted with both hands, steadies even the most unfaithful weather. Jonathan delivered his phone and watched to a drawer in his rented farmhouse, wrote a letter to his partners that said only what needed saying, that he would be away for a while and would not be reachable. He wrapped the thing that had once defined him in a scrap of brown paper and put it where he would not see it every time he opened the drawer for a pen. He moved through the world slower, and the world, in a mercy he had never extended it, did not punish him for doing so. He missed calls he could not prove would have mattered. He met sunrises that did. Autumn let go and winter took the fields in her blunt fist. Frost-stitched lace on the window panes, and the barn's breath was visible each morning, a beast exhaling peace. They mended what the fire had taken, plank by plank, and in every nail he hammered Jonathan found a catechism that required no memory work. Be present, be patient, be plain. The year they had named began to grow rings like an oak. He learned the songs they sang, not all at once, but in that slow way tunes become part of the body through repetition. He made mistakes and said, "I'm sorry," and did not decorate the apology with reasons. He learned to listen until the ache of wanting to talk passed, and the hearing became habit. He took his turn with the milk in January when it was a punishment, and in March when it was a promise. He learned to pray in sentences too simple to impress anyone, and therefore honest enough to be received. He gave Mary space so clean of demand that it embarrassed him when he realized how rare a gift it had been in him before. Spring returned as if it had never left, green shouldering brown aside with the swagger of a beloved season. By then, some of the neighbors who had looked at him askance began to treat him not as a curiosity, but as a regular variable in the town's equation. He had become a man who could be asked to help move a piano, who could be counted on to show up with a hammer and no need to borrow one. He did not become Amish, not in the sense that would satisfy any formal ledger, but he became less English in the way that mattered. He quit narrating his goodness to himself in private, quit tallying his sacrifices like a secret ledger he would produce at some trial to win mercy. Sometimes he forgot the drawer where his watch slept and only remembered because the light warned him of evening. Sometimes he remembered and did not touch it. On the first truly warm day, he and Mary walked out to the fields without a word. The oak was fat with leaves, the sky extravagant with blue. and they sat under a shade the tree offered because it always had. It was there, in that shade, with the smell of cut grass fierce in their noses, and the quiet of two people who had worked side by side, so long they no longer needed, to fill every minute with language, that Jonathan asked her to marry him again. He did not kneel. He did not produce a ring. He asked her as a man asks a woman who has taught him what asking means. Not a gavel, not a bargain, not a dare, but a vow offered unclothed. Mary looked at him as if measuring not his words, but the year behind them, the calluses on his hands, the grooves labor had pressed into his face, the way his eyes now met and held without telegraphing their desire to be approved. She said yes with a single nod that could have been missed by anyone not watching, then said it again with a whisper meant not for the air but for him. The harvest that year would not be potatoes or corn or hay. It would be a wedding boiled down to what mattered and nothing else. There were no invitations. The community understood, as communities do when they are honest and have known grief enough to recognize joy's true shape. On the appointed morning, chosen not for symbolism, but because the chores could be made to bend to it, Mary braided her hair and covered it with the simple cap she had worn the day he first stopped on the road. Jonathan washed and put on a white shirt that had been sewn for him by Mary's aunt, the stitches small and neat, the collar playing. The bishop came with two elders. The table was cleared of everything but a Bible that had belonged to Mary's mother, its pages thin as onion skin, its margins crowded with a handwriting that looked like listening. They stood facing one another in the kitchen, where life happens, and spoke vows in words that could be carried in a child's pocket. I will stand beside you. I will work with you. I will forgive you. I will not leave you when the field is barren. There was no music. There was only the sound of their voices and the creak of the floor and a robin insisting on his place in the morning outside the open window. When it was done, the bishop nodded, and Mary's father placed his hand, scarred, enormous, tender, on both their shoulders and said a blessing that did not waste a word. They ate bread and soup and pie with a handful of neighbors who had come not as spectators, but as participants in the kind of promise that makes a community a lattice strong enough to grow a life on. After the dishes were washed, after the bishop had gone, after the house slowly found its normal sounds again, Jonathan and Mary stepped onto the porch where the afternoon had already gone a little soft with the approach of evening. The land lay before them the way a book lies open to the chapter you know will change everything that came before it if you read it properly. Jonathan felt an ache he could not name and did not fear. He turned to say something about gratitude and unworthiness and the odd, undeserved mercy of a road that had allowed him, step by brutal step, to come all the way here. Before he could, Mary reached into the pocket of her dress and took out a folded piece of paper that had been worn to velvet at the edges. She held it between them, her face composed, but her eyes bright with a complicated light he had not yet learned to read. "There is something you should see," she said, and her voice carried not accusation and not triumph, but a steadiness that tasted of truth. She opened the paper slowly, as if careful of something brittle inside it, and the look on her face, the tenderness, the sorrow, the hint of a smile that did not belong to victory, moved through him like a weather change so complete that for a heartbeat he could not remember the man he had been before this day, or how the sky had looked above his head when he still believed he controlled it. Jonathan took the paper from her hand slowly, his fingers brushing the callous tips of hers, and for a fleeting second he felt the urge to refuse it, to keep whatever it contained at bay for just a few more moments. But Mary's gaze was steady, expectant without being forceful, and he knew that turning away now would be a step back into the man he had been when he first drove into Lancaster County with arrogance, riding shotgun. The paper was folded into quarters, worn along the creases so much that the fibers threatened to give way. He unfolded it with care, the faint scent of wood smoke clinging to it, and as the sheet opened in his hands he recognized the bold, careless scrawl immediately. It was the contract, the same one from that night in the country club, the one signed in jest and greed and pride, the one he had envisioned burning in his farmhouse kitchen. Only now, it had been handled, kept carried. The ink was slightly smudged in one corner, and across the top margin, in a small, tidy handwriting that was unmistakably Mary's, were the words. "Do you still believe in this?" His stomach turned over, not from shock that she knew. Somewhere in him, he had always suspected she might, but from the knowledge that she had chosen the exact moment to put it in his hands. She had waited, she had watched, and she had given him the time and the rope to either hang himself or climb. He looked at her, searching for anger, for betrayal, for anything that would give him a clear enemy to fight in this moment. But what he found was more difficult to face. Her expression was calm, almost unreadable, but behind it was the depth of someone who had been observing him far longer than he realized. "When?" he asked, his voice lower than he intended, the single word heavy in his throat. "The day after you came to the farm," she replied. "I went into town to deliver bread. One of the men there, someone who knows your world more than ours, told me about the bet. He didn't know I was the one in it. Or maybe he did. Either way, it was enough for me to find out what I needed." She said it without accusation, without heat. "I thought about asking you then, but I wanted to see whether you would tell me yourself, and what kind of man you were when you thought no one knew." Her words landed without flourish, without dramatic sting, but they burrowed deeper than any shouted condemnation could have. Jonathan felt the weight of every day that had passed under her silent watch, each moment replaying itself now with the added knowledge that she had been testing him, measuring him, not against the easy standard of apology, but against the harder one of change. He tried to speak, to explain how he had wrestled with telling her, how the bet had turned to ash in his mind long before this day, how every choice in the past months had been a step toward her rather than toward victory. But the words felt like a defense, and he knew a defense would cheapen the truth. So instead, he held the paper out in front of him and tore it once, then again, the pieces falling into the porch light in jagged, fluttering shapes. He let them scatter onto the boards between them, the fragments small enough that no one could ever reassemble them. Mary watched without moving, her hands folded loosely in front of her. When the last piece had settled, she stepped forward and placed her palm flat against his chest, over his heart. "It's not the paper I needed to see gone," she said softly. "It's the man who signed it. I think he's been leaving for some time now." Her hand dropped away, and with it came a strange lightness, though not the careless kind he had once known. This was the kind that came after carrying something heavy far enough to set it down. In the days that followed, their marriage settled into the quiet, unadorned reality that was its truest form. There was no fanfare, no performance for the outside world, only the steady layering of days built from work, meals, conversations, and silences that were no longer strained. Jonathan found himself rising before the sun, not because it was expected, but because he wanted to. His body now tuned to the rhythm of the land. He learned the subtle signs of weather in the shape of clouds at dawn, the way the soil spoke through the soles of his boots, the difference in a cow's lowing when something was wrong. Mary never treated him like a guest, nor like a man who had earned special favor. He was simply part of the whole, woven into the fabric of the farm's life. And in that place, among those people, he began to understand that love was not the fireworks he had once chased, but the accumulation of small, consistent acts that asked nothing in return. Winter came hard that year, the kind of cold that silences even the birds, that leaves breath hanging in the air like smoke from an unseen fire. Jonathan worked through it alongside Mary's family, mending, hauling, and tending to the animals with a steadiness that no longer surprised them. On the coldest nights, when the wind rattled the shutters and the stove's heat only reached so far, they would sit together at the kitchen table, Mary sewing while Jonathan read aloud from books he had brought in from town. Sometimes he would catch her watching him over the rim of her mug, her expression somewhere between curiosity and something softer. He never asked what she was thinking in those moments. He was learning that not all questions needed answers, that some were better left to grow quietly between them. By the time spring returned, the traces of the man who had first arrived in Lancaster County were almost gone. His suits hung untouched in the closet of his farmhouse, his watch still buried in the drawer where he had left it. He no longer counted the days on a calendar, no longer measured his life in deadlines or deals. The farm had its own clock, its own measures, and he had learned to live within them. Mary noticed the changes without comment, the same way she noticed the seasons, by the way they moved. not by the words used to name them. The trust between them, once so fragile it felt like glass in his hands, had taken root in something far sturdier. It was not the blind trust of the naive. It was the tempered trust of those who had seen the worst of each other and chosen to remain. One evening, as they walked back from the fields, Jonathan asked her why she had given him the paper only after they were married. She thought for a long time before answering, her steps slow and deliberate on the worn path. "Because if I gave it to you before, your choice would have been about the bet," she said finally. "I needed to know whether your choice was about me. And if it wasn't, then I'd rather find that out when the truth had nothing left to hide behind." Her voice held no bitterness, only the kind of clarity that came from looking directly at something difficult until it lost the power to frighten. Jonathan nodded, understanding in a way he could not have months earlier. The gamble had never been hers, not really. It had always been his, and the stakes had been far higher than he realized. The farm that summer was abundant, the fields green and heavy with promise. Jonathan worked with a quiet satisfaction, knowing that each row he planted, each fence he repaired, each load he carried was part of something that would outlast him. The bet, the contract, the arrogance of his arrival, all of it felt like a story that belonged to another man. And in its place was the life he had built here, not by conquest, but by consent, earned day by day in the simple act of staying. There were still moments when he caught himself looking toward the horizon, wondering what his old life was doing without him. But those moments passed quickly, replaced by the sight of Mary at the end of the row, her dress brushing the tops of the plants, her hair catching the light in a way that made the whole world feel anchored. On the anniversary of the fire, the community gathered again, this time not in urgency, but in celebration of the barn's restoration. There was food, laughter, and the easy company of people who had shared both hardship and joy. Jonathan moved among them not as an outsider, but as someone who belonged, his name called out in greetings, his hand clasped in the firm grips of neighbors who now trusted him to show up when it mattered. Late in the evening, when the lanterns threw their soft glow across the yard and the music from a single fiddle wound its way through the air, Mary found him leaning against the fence, watching the scene. She stepped close, her hand finding his in a way that was as natural as breathing. "You never answered my question," she said quietly. "Do you still believe in it?" For a moment he didn't understand, and then he realized she meant the words she had written on the contract. He smiled faintly, shaking his head. "No," he said, "I believe in something else now." She didn't ask what that something was, and he didn't try to name it. Some things, they both knew, were better lived than defined. The proposals on the table were not glamorous, and that was precisely why they felt right in Jonathan's hands. They read like instructions for mending a gate. Straighten the hinge, replace the bent nails, sand the swollen wood, oil what sticks, test the swing, and test it again. He watched the faces around the conference table move from skepticism to the twitchy interest of men who sensed, despite themselves, the steadier profit of a business that behaved like a craft instead of a trick. He did not sell the plan as virtue. He sold it as durability. Mary sat quietly at the end of the table the first time she joined, not as ornament but as trustee, her back straight, her eyes taking the measure of everything said and left unsaid. When numbers needed confirming, she asked the kind of questions that put hands back on the real levers. What happens to late shift coverage if you cut those hours on paper? Who cleans the 8th floor after a party when the overtime line is already read? If the software migration saves money in theory, who trains the clerk who is 58 and never asked for a new screen? She did not argue abstractions. She asked about people with names, and the names forced the room to remember the work they hid behind acronyms. When the chairman tried a small condescension, a glossed explanation of a concept she understood better than he did, she let the correction land with a gentleness that was not weakness. "I'm not asking what it is," she said. "I'm asking who pays for it when the calendar flips to the end of the month." After that, explanations arrived cleaner. Jonathan watched the shift with a gratitude that pulsed low and constant, like a second heartbeat that had learned the farm's tempo and brought it to the city without apology. The article that had tried to reduce Mary to a curiosity did not die as quickly as anyone hoped. Gossip rarely does when it has rhythm, but it lost its bite as the weeks accumulated and the story it wanted, of a rich boy's misadventure, refused to manifest. The city found other appetites to feed, and Lancaster's refusal to participate in the spectacle proved contagious. In church on Sunday, the elders did not mention the noise. They preached about patience and harvest and the sin of envy, and no one looked at Mary any longer than they would have otherwise. At the hospital, the nurses learned her name and no longer introduced her as the Amish wife to new staff with a tone that expected surprise. Jonathan's father improved by inches, and then stalled on a ledge the doctors began to call his plateau. His speech returned in small parcels wrapped in fatigue. His left hand learned to lift a spoon again after weeks of sulking. He and Jonathan inhabited a truce that did not require explanations for days gone wrong. Sometimes the old man stared out the window at a sky cut into rectangles by buildings and asked if the field still needed rain. Sometimes he closed his eyes while Jonathan read board minutes with their new vocabulary and nodded approval at sentences that would have earned a cough of skepticism a year earlier. On an afternoon heavy with impending weather, he asked for Mary and took her hand and told her, with effort and without flourish, that he had chosen her for the trust because she had not come to him asking permission to be who she already was. She thanked him the way she thanked a neighbor who had returned a borrowed tool, sincerely, briefly, without announcing a debt that would become a burden. The committee's changes began to show up where changes proved themselves. In the rooms where paychecks meet rent and in the hallways where men used to pretend not to know each other's names. The janitor on the committee, Luis, proposed a night shift rotation that gave people back 2 Saturdays a month. The receptionist, Ms. Webb, mapped the real path customers walked through a building the architects had drawn to look good on a brochure and save them time and therefore money. The loading dock man, Evan, fixed 3 small logistics knots that had never made it into a deck because their pain was never high enough to trend. Dividends held steady, smaller than brokers preferred but more honest than promises that bought applause with next winter's grain. In Lancaster, the barn carried the smell of cut hay and warmed animals into autumn. Fences stood straight where once they had leaned with the fatigue of years. The milk checks came when they were supposed to. Jonathan learned what it meant to commute in a way no magazine would ever photograph. Dawn chores and boots that drank dew. A pickup to the train station. A train to a city where he kept 2 shirts and 1 tie in an office closet. A walk through a lobby where security now greeted him by name because he asked for theirs first. Meetings too long for anyone's good that he learned to cut by naming what mattered. An evening ride back to a house where the lamp on the kitchen table made a circle of light as sovereign as any board seal. He grew a little thinner in the face and a little stronger in the hands, and the mirror each morning stopped negotiating with him about what kind of man he was trying to be. Autumn bit down and the light went slant, with the fields settled into their quiet work and the city plan no longer threatening to blow its seams. Space opened, the small kind, the kind that lets a person notice the sound their own breath makes when it moves through the house before dawn. Mary began to tire earlier in the evenings in a way that did not match the day's labor. She waved it off as the hangover from months of strain, then took to sitting sometimes with both hands folded low, a gesture Jonathan recognized only later in photographs of other women. She told him one night the way she told him most things, by letting silence get comfortable first. He understood before she finished a sentence, his body registering the news with a stuttering rush that could have been fear if joy had not claimed it first. There was no spectacle, no squeal, no sudden choreography. He stood and pressed his forehead to the top of her head and felt her laugh move through both of them. They did not tell the city. They told the kitchen, folding the knowledge into the ordinary as if it had always been meant to hide there. At the hospital, Jonathan waited for a morning when his father's attention was stitched tight enough to hold. He told him in 5 words. The old man closed his eyes and let out a breath that trembled into something like a sob before it retreated to the pride that had kept him upright all his life. He took Jonathan's wrist in his good hand and squeezed once, hard, a blessing in the grammar of men who learned intimacy late and then used it carefully. News did not announce itself to the board. It altered the edges of Jonathan's decisions, what meetings he accepted, which he sent in his place the quiet man from compliance, who had once been ignored in every room. When the chairman side-eyed the absenteeism that had a pattern to it, Jonathan named it before anyone else could. There would be days he would be on a train by 3 o'clock because Lancaster understood the idea of limits better than this floor did. He offered no apology and less drama. The trust had taught the board to listen when he pointed to the long line, rather than the short spike. They learned to interpret his refusals as early warnings rather than moral theater. Some afternoons he stayed late anyway when it mattered, and then drove all night in a car that smelled of coffee, arriving at the farm in time to watch the first gray return to the fields and the black line of buggies start down the road like punctuation. The trouble that would have become the end of everything if it had arrived a year earlier announced itself, with the kind of disguised politeness that always angered Jonathan more than a clean blow. A private equity fund hungry for headlines began to circle the company, with the soft-spoken menace of men who had learned that kindness sells ruin more efficiently than swagger. They framed themselves as partners with fresh eyes and deeper pockets, and the kind of patience that wears an expensive watch. Their proposal was a gilded recitation of efficiencies that always meant other people's jobs. It promised returns that sang to ears trained by quarterly hymns. The chairman, who had grown cautious since the trust revealed a spine he did not know he possessed, wavered. The fund, faster than rumor, hired one of Jonathan's old club companions as a strategic advisor. And the man went on television with the tidy malice of someone who never learned to build a thing and therefore only learned to buy them. He told a story about a firm captured by an heir's provincial experiments and a board cowed by a farmer's wife. The insult slid across the screen in the language of concern, and for the first time in months the thing inside Jonathan that used to hunt for victory stirred hard enough to make his hands want for fists. Mary's answer to insult was the same as to praise. Assign it a weight and place it where it belongs. She did not ask him to be saintly. She asked him to be specific. On the porch that night, with the map of stars he had learned to read showing autumn's familiar shapes above them, she told him what he already knew, but had needed to hear in the voice that governed his better decisions. When the long thing, not the flash. The trust required both their signatures. The company required both their patience. The community required that they not turn this into an argument performed like theater when it was a choice that would decide whether the janitor could keep both his Saturdays and his dignity. The shock in the title he had once lived like a threat began to ripen into something else, a revelation that did not end a life, but arranged it. He understood, maybe for the first time without reservation, that the wager made years ago had reached through time to hand him a different kind of bet. Could he protect two worlds without lying to either of them? He kissed her forehead and wrote the speech he would deliver at the shareholder meeting in the plainest words he had. He did not mention virtue when he stood at the podium. He mentioned math and fatigue and the law of diminishing returns of workforces treated as replaceable parts. He did not sell romance to men who did not buy it. He sold the pragmatic profit of slowness. He showed what the company had spent cleaning up the churn of unrest that always follows sudden efficiencies. He showed the retention curve that had flattened since the changes. He showed the note from a client who had stayed because the same receptionist answered the phone every time for 14 years and knew his voice even when a cold stole it. And then he did something the room had not expected. He named Mary as co-trustee, not by title, but by the kind of witness that makes titles unnecessary. He described the day they spent recalculating a schedule so a single mother on the accounts team could make the bus that got her home before the sitter had to leave. He described the line item they cut in software that looked good on paper and bad in hands. He described the question she asked that had saved them thousands of hours of future apology. "We can sell now for a number you will be proud to repeat at a party," he said, "and then spend the next 5 years explaining to ourselves why the number we earned later never reached what it could have. Or we can build a company that will still be paying our grandchildren's dividends because it learned to match the speed of its ambition to the speed of its responsibility." He stopped there. He did not ask for applause. He did not offer a video. He simply stepped back and let the truth stand in its work clothes. The vote did not break cleanly. It rarely does when men have spent a lifetime believing that speed is the only proof they are alive. But the trust, like a spine, held. Enough shareholders had grown tired of the churn to choose a steadier table. The private equity fund withdrew with the bland statement such withdrawals always get, and the television advisor pivoted to a new outrage with the flexibility of a reed that has never tried to be a tree. Jonathan left the stage to a rustle that was more relief than celebration. He faxed the results, because the old machine in the hospital still ran better than the new one, to his father, and found the old man sleeping with his mouth slightly open, not graceful and not ashamed. He sat and watched the breath move and felt, with a gratitude that did not feel noble at all, that some shocks arrived not to shatter, but to settle. On the farm, the first frost silvered the field edges and made the morning light look like a blessing that had been learning their names in secret. Mary moved more slowly now, and no one scolded her. Work redistributed itself, the way water finds lower ground. Jonathan discovered he could be in two places without lying to either one, not because he had mastered logistics, but because he had finally learned to let each place be itself when he was gone. The community that had once doubted him now left casseroles on the porch without comments. The board that had once patronized him now called 2 hours early to move meetings, because the train had become a schedule everyone accommodated without pretending it was quaint. He marked the days until winter with the quiet greed of a man counting steps to a door he cannot wait to open. On an evening when the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and stars seemed close enough to hear, he sat with Mary on the porch and listened to the house settle around them with the small pops and sighs that tell a family it has survived the day. There was nothing left in him of the boy who had thought love was a stunt or success a costume. There was only a husband about to become a father, and a son about to become the kind of man his father might have been if someone had asked different questions sooner. Winter came inside with a quiet that made even laughter feel respectful. When the call from the hospital finally arrived in the thin hour before dawn, Jonathan dressed fast by instinct, and then slower by choice, as if to tell time it would not rush him through this door. Mary took his hand and squeezed once and said nothing that would cheapen the moment with the pretense of control. He reached the room in time to hear the last of the machine music still trying for rhythm, in time to take the hand that had taught him the wrong lessons first and the right ones later, in time to say thank you in a voice that broke the way old ice breaks in spring. His father left the way men like him live, reluctantly and then all at once. Jonathan stood and did not perform grief. He let it come like weather and pass through like weather. And when he was ready, he called Mary and told her with the same simplicity she had taught him to use for joy. He returned to Lancaster that evening to a kitchen where a kettle already sang and bread already cooled, and a chair had been pulled out for him without fanfare. He sat and placed his head on his folded arms on the table like a schoolboy out of prayers. Mary rested her hand on the back of his neck and held it there until the muscles' tension gave up and the house remembered it had been built to shelter this too. The shock promised by the title had revealed itself not as a single explosion, but as a series of permissions he had never expected to receive. To refuse speed, to love without performance, to lead without lying, to bury a father without rewriting the story, to build a company that acted like a farm, to trust a world with his child before he had proof it would be gentle. In the weeks after the funeral, he carried those permissions around like tools, using them on broken hinges and swollen doors, finding that they fit more locks than he would have guessed. And as the first snow pressed its quiet palm to the fields, as the company's year closed with numbers that did not sparkle but did not burn, as Mary's belly rounded into the future so visibly that even strangers softened when they met her in town, Jonathan understood that the wager had not been whether he could win a woman. It had been whether he could lose a self. He had, and the loss had made room where a life could be built. The child was born on a morning when the snow outside lay smooth and untouched, as if the world had been remade in silence, just for their arrival. The birth was not easy, but it was honest, and when the baby's first cry cut through the dim, warm air of the farmhouse bedroom, Jonathan felt a weight in his chest that was both anchor and sail. He looked at Mary, her hair damp against her temples, her eyes steady in the way they always were when she had done something hard and knew she would do it again if asked. She placed a small, wriggling bundle into his arms, and he stared down at a face that was both unfamiliar and inevitable, a map drawn from two worlds that had once seemed too far apart to meet. In that moment, everything about the bet, the boardrooms, the articles, the fights, and even the reconciliations faded into the background like old wallpaper beneath new paint. He knew then, with a clarity that needed no ceremony, that every road he had been forced to walk, whether by pride, by shame, or by love, had been leading here. In the weeks that followed, the farmhouse became a place where time bent in unexpected ways. Days could stretch endlessly with feedings, chores, and the slow rhythm of recovery. Yet weeks seemed to vanish in a blink as the child grew, eyes opening wider, fingers curling around Jonathan's thumb with the strength of a promise. He still traveled to the city when needed, but now the company's affairs moved with a calm he had fought hard to protect, its foundation steadier under the guidance of decisions made with patience rather than panic. The board had learned, some grudgingly and some gladly, that their work could be measured not only in quarterly returns, but in the absence of fires to put out. And in Lancaster, the community that had once watched him with guarded curiosity now came to the door with warm bread, hand-sewn clothes, and the kind of advice that was offered only after a man had been deemed part of the fabric. Jonathan accepted each gesture with the quiet respect of someone who understood that trust, once earned, is a debt that must be paid daily. On a cold evening in late winter, Jonathan stood again on the porch, the baby sleeping against his chest under a thick wool blanket, Mary beside him, with her arm looped through his. The fields lay dormant, waiting for spring's call, the stars sharp and endless above. He thought of the man who had arrived here with a wager in his pocket and arrogance in his stride, and he felt a faint, almost incredulous gratitude that life had found a way to strip him down to something worth keeping. He looked at Mary, who was watching the horizon as if she could already see the green returning, and he realized that the true shock, the one no headline could ever capture, was not that he had married an Amish girl because of a bet, but that she had stayed, and together they had built a life sturdy enough to hold both the weight of the past and the promise of what was yet to come. And as the night settled around them, he thought not about winning or losing, but about showing up, day after day, to the life they had chosen. If you have followed their journey this far, it is worth remembering that stories like theirs are not built on moments alone. They are carried by those willing to keep walking. Subscribe, because the next road is always just beyond the edge of the lamplight.